Welcome, everyone. My name is Deborah Gallant, and you are at a deep dive being presented by Entrepreneurs Forever. We do this every month on a topic that I have heard from entrepreneurs that you would like to know more about, get better at, that doesn't really fit within the confines of your regular monthly peer group meetings. So this month, I'm inviting somebody who I actually have had present for me before. Dr. Joshua Weiss is in Western Mass, and he is an expert. I'm going to let him give you all his own credentials on negotiation. And he did a very similar presentation when I worked at E4All a few years ago, and I really thought this was worth bringing back. So we're going to do a few intro slides, and then we're going to get right to it. So I'm going to just make sure that you all understand sort of what you're here to do. I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Weiss, and we record the presentation part of today, and then the sharing and open discussion at the end. We do not record, so you can feel like you're in a safe space if you want to ask about a specific relationship or a negotiation and get advice. So if you are in a place that you can do it, I would love to see you type into the chat. So it'll help both myself and Dr. Weiss talk to you about your business, what your business is. And if you have a thought or a question, an issue about negotiation that you would like to specifically have him address. Entrepreneurs Forever's mission is to empower all small business owners to grow thriving businesses that sustain their families and support their communities. We primarily do that with monthly peer support groups. Um, Next month's deep dive, I always put this up front because I forget if I wait till the end, is about customer loyalty, and it is with one of our facilitators, Virginia Crocker Timmons. So I hope you'll join me for that. Today's topic, again, negotiation skills for small business owners. And I hope that you had time. It's a snowy day in the East Coast. There were two videos that were in your email confirmation that he asked you to look at. And if we want, we can watch them here, but I'm sure he'll refer to them. Just thought I'd remind you that there were two videos. And today's presentation does not take the place of professional advice from your own paid advisors. So, having done that warning, I'm going to stop sharing. Um, Joshua, do you want to just introduce yourself before you dive in?
Sure, happy to. Hi, everybody. Nice to be with you. It was a little uncertain given the weather out here in Western Mass and the lovely blizzard that just came on through. As Deborah said, my name's Josh Weiss. I have been working in the world of leadership, negotiation, and dealing with conflict for the better part of 30 years. Essentially, I kind of have three buckets of things that I do. The first is that I run a project at a place called the Program on Negotiation, which is a negotiation think tank based at Harvard Law School. And it's the project that I run with a colleague is called the Global Negotiation Initiative. And we actually do a lot of international negotiation work, dealing with conflicts and things along those lines. The second bucket of things is a master's degree in leadership, organizational leadership and negotiation at Bay Path University, which is a smaller school out in Western Mass, about 5,000 students now after we acquired Cambridge College. And then finally, I have my own consulting company. So I do a lot of training, advising, coaching, getting involved, representing companies and things along those lines. The coaching, that kind of training work covers the gamut. I work with governments, businesses, for-profit, nonprofit, you name it. I'm not sure there's an industry I haven't worked with. It kind of feels like that at least. So that's kind of what I do and do a lot of these kinds of webinars and things along those lines to help people to understand what does effective negotiation look like? Because it's a core skill and knowledge set. And I think there's a lot of people out there who don't realize how much they negotiate on a regular basis. You do it all day, every day. And so we'll get into some of that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I put together some slides so you don't have to look at me and you can look at them. Um, and yeah, So let's gonna go ahead and dive on in. I'm gonna let you know kind of where we're headed here. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is sort of what I would call the mindset of a successful negotiator. Um, Part of the reason I do this is because I think, again, I think there's a lot of things out there about what does it mean to be a successful negotiator. And from where I sit, frankly, people get it wrong a lot. And so we'll talk about the mindset of a successful negotiator, and then we'll talk about some common myths that are out there that um, I think people tend to believe are true, but I don't think so. So, and you can challenge me. I have zero problem with that. Part of this is to be a bit provocative, but it's also based on my own experience, having done this work for a long time. Then we'll talk about a few barriers to success and the importance of managing emotions. And spoiler alert, manages play or emotions play a role in your negotiations, whether you like it or not. So the notion of keeping emotions out, which is often what people think they should do, is actually not possible and gets you in more trouble than helps you. Then I will shift over and talk about the two primary models of negotiation, when you might use each, and then I'm going to focus a little bit on the second one and give you a couple of thoughts related to that because I think most of your negotiations are going to fall into that category. Okay, so that's where we're going. So let's go ahead and dive in, as the title of our session is a deep dive. So let's do that. So um, I want to begin by talking about your mindset. And to be very frank, I think people don't understand or think enough about their mindset when it comes to negotiation. It is a central notion of negotiation. It's critically important. And honestly, I spend a lot of time now in my trainings, almost as much time talking about the other and dynamics and things like that as what's going on between your ears, because I genuinely believe that this is often where success or failure comes about. So, when it comes to the mindset of a successful negotiator, um, these are the things that I think are critically important. The first thing is that successful negotiators don't assume negotiations are win-lose. Of course, there are some win-lose negotiations in life, but most of them are not. And if we go into a negotiation with that orientation, thinking someone's going to get what they need and someone's not, then that's how we view every problem, right? If every problem looks like a nail, then um, we use a hammer all the time. And there may be times when we need to use a hammer, but much of the time, that's not the case. So, just to begin, I want to encourage you to be thinking about and coming in to a negotiation with more of a problem-solving mindset. The other negotiator is not your friend, they're not your enemy, they are a potential partner. And so it's important to see it that way because negotiation, from my point of view, which we'll talk more about, is really about problem solving and creative problem solving at that. So, number one, try to come in with a mindset that is also curious and open and exploratory in nature. The second point about mindset is that you're firm on your end goal, but flexible on how you get to that end goal. There are often many ways to get to the same end, but what I see is that often people, when they prepare to negotiate, they think about what they need, but then they think about one way to get there. And when you do that, you really limit yourself and you close off possible avenues for creative solutions. So, what I advocate and what I try to help people to do is, first of all, I help them to prepare in the right way. And what that means is not walking into a negotiation with a specific plan, because negotiations are interdependent processes. And the other side doesn't know what your plan is. And frankly, much of the time, they don't care that you have a plan, right? They're not going to follow it. They have their own objectives and interests. So you want to have a goal, right? But you also want to sort of be planning from what I like to call a contingency mindset. And what that means is that you think, all right, well, let me think about here's what I'm trying to achieve. What are the different ways that I can get to that end state? And I think when you have that mindset, you recognize there are things that you're going to learn that are out of your control, and you're able to adapt better. And I think this is also something that's not quite on this list, but negotiations are always centered around the problem of incomplete information. If I'm negotiating with Deborah, she comes into a negotiation knowing certain things, and I come into a negotiation knowing certain things. We may know some of the same things, but there's absolutely things that I'm bringing to the table she is not aware of, and vice versa. And so I have to have that kind of approach and orientation because she is going to say something along the way that I didn't know was part of the negotiation, or she might add a complicating factor in. So if you have that way of thinking, then you're not surprised, you're not taken aback, and you don't get thrown off um, because the other side doesn't want to go down the one road that you thought to take them down. Okay.
Josh, I am a total agreement about problem solving, but sometimes
Yep.
it feels like a negotiation is truly binary. Let's say you're my landlord and I'm renewing my lease, and I
Hmm.
just want it to stay the same. And maybe I can afford a 5% increase, but I know that you're trying to do 20% increases across the board. That feels
Yeah.
very binary. Either you're going to give me my deal or you're not going to, isn't it?
Well, no. And here's why. Because there are other things. Well, okay, maybe Summer could actually answer that question because she just said, I'm a landlord. It's not binary. Summer, tell me why it's not binary, please.
Oh, geez. Yeah. So I
I agree with you
generally,
wholeheartedly, by the way. So,
yeah. If I have a great tenant,
hmm.
sometimes if they move out over, let's say I want to increase the rent by $100 a month,
Yep.
and you can only afford 25, but you've been a great tenant for the last year, you've always paid on time. It's going to cost me more money to have you move out and take at least a month to find a
Yeah.
new tenant. And I'm going to have to renovate the apartment. I'm going to have to, fix anything that maybe you didn't tell me about or were living with. So honestly, I'm going to lose more money than whatever $100 a month increase that I
Yeah.
would be charging you. So
Right.
actually, it's really in your favor. No one's ever tried to bargain with me on that, but they absolutely
Mhm.
could.
And they
But
probably should have.
right. But to your
Don't
point,
tell them
Summer,
that.
Summer, you brought up exactly, in my mind, the right stuff, right? And what you're getting at is there are lots of other things that people value in a negotiation. It's not just the money. Because as you said, if you have a good tenants are hard to come by, right? Bad tenants, once you've had a bad tenant, you don't want to go down that road again. And so if somebody's good, they pay on time, they keep the place clean, like those are all things that matter to you. And so you're going to want to keep them as opposed to going into the unknown with somebody else, right? So, but Deborah, I think it's a really important point because negotiation is about what people value. And the problem is much of the time people only think about dollars and cents, but there's lots of other things that people care about. And Summer just laid out three or four of them immediately, right? And that's exactly why I was going to say it's not binary because there are other things. I mean, I would also imagine, for example, that and we have a rental property as well that we rent and et cetera. So I'm sort of in that landlord space. Um, you know, I, for example, like it would be great value to me if I could lock up somebody for 3 years as opposed to a year. And I know they're a good tenant, that's steady income, blah, 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 right? Any way I can take away uncertainty, that's a goal of mine in the negotiation. So this is why it's so important to think about negotiation as a search for value and a search for what do people really care about. And too often we get so fixated on the dollars and cents that we don't talk about the other things that might actually bring us value. And so we'll get into more of that, but exactly what and there are a lot of negotiations that masquerade as win-lose, right? Or binary in that sense. And by the way, to your point, more money for me is less money for you. There are dimensions of that that are important and are part of a negotiation, but it's not the whole thing. And that's where I think you have to broaden the scope. And, it's like when I talk to people about a job negotiation. As you might imagine, lots of people ask me about salary negotiations, right? So how do I do the best I can? And one of the first things that I say to people is, I want you to put aside the salary for a minute. I want to talk about all the things that you care about when it comes to this job, because there could be professional development, right? There could be flex time, there could be benefits, there could be whatever, right? Growth opportunities within the company. Those are things that you can ask for that most of the time people don't, and they have real value. It's not that it's tangential. Those things really can matter to folks. So think about what you're doing in negotiation as searching for value, searching for what it is that people like, what you care about, and be really clear about that and think broadly about it, and understand that the other side does as well. And there are certain things, as a landlord, there are certain things that you can do that don't really cost you much, right? I mean, if a tenant says to you, hey, I'd really like, instead of a 1 year lease, I'd really like a 2 or a 3 year lease because I want to stay here. This is a great place for me and my family or whatever, right? Like that very likely has value for you because, again, you have stability. So think that way. Back to our list here for a second. So another point here is that you're willing to walk away but not leave permanently. There are times when negotiation's difficult and the other side is playing games, and you need to sort of say to them, listen, look, what we're doing right now doesn't work for me. Like it doesn't meet my goals and my objectives. So here's my card or here's my number. Feel free to give me a shout if change your mind or have a different perspective. And I will tell you that there have been a lot of times where I've walked away from negotiations, um, knowing the risks, of course, and understanding that, but always keeping the door open. I had a colleague named Roger Fisher who was one of the authors of a very famous, probably the most famous negotiation book called Getting to Yes. If you haven't read it, you should. And Roger used to say, don't be afraid to, I mean, and I'm going to date him now because this goes back a while and you'll see why in a minute. He said, don't be afraid to hang up the phone, but don't cut the wire, right? So we're talking about a time when we still had wires on phones, right? But you get the idea that sometimes you hang up the phone and it sends a message that, hey, I'm not going to come off of my objective, but I'm also not so rigid in my demands that I'm not open to thinking differently and creatively. The next point is really that you understand the interconnected nature of the relationship. So negotiations are interdependent, right? I don't get what I want unless you say yes, and vice versa. So if somebody ever says to me, that's your problem, let me know when you've sorted it out and get back to me. And I'm like, you don't really know how to negotiate if you tell me that, because you need me to say yes to get what you want. And so it's really important that you keep in mind that this is an interconnected relationship and that that's how this works. And negotiation is a back and forth. And that's why problem solving is so important, because if we can get into those kinds of conversations, we're far more likely to find a solution in the end, because I'm thinking not only about what I need, but what the other person needs. And this a classic mistake that people make in negotiation is they don't think about what the other side needs. But if I need to persuade them, right? If I need to help them to say yes to what I'm looking for, I have to know where their mind is, right? I mean, it's kind of logical. And so for me not to give any thought to what matters to them is really sort of foolish. The last one is a really important one, and I don't know how to emphasize this enough, but let me put it to you this way. Um, from my point of view, assumptions are the silent killers of effective negotiation. And you might be wondering, why do I say that? And the reason I say that is because when you make an assumption, it creates a story, right? We start with an assumption and then we create a whole story about what's going on. The other side's greedy, and so like they're not going to be open to these kinds of things, whatever it is, right? And so we create that um, story based on assumptions and the perceptions we hold of them. And that can really cloud our ability to be curious and to kind of deal with uncertainty and to think in uncertain ways. And so you have to be really careful when you make assumptions about what's possible and what's not. I work with a lot of people and I'll coach them and they'll say, there's no way they're going to do that. I'm like, how do you know? Did you ask them? Or have you already just decided based on past interactions or information from somebody else that this isn't going to happen. You don't know. And so you're already limiting yourself greatly by making that assumption and saying that that's not possible. I, you know, I'm at a place in my life where I would refer to myself as a possibilist. So a possibilist is not an optimist, they're not a pessimist, but they're always looking for the possible. And the way that you do that is you go in with a curious mindset. There's a great quote by Voltaire who said, if you think uncertainty is a daunting proposition, try certainty. And what he's trying to get at is if you come into a negotiation or any situation so certain of your perspective and your point of view, you're not going to be open to anything else. You're going to dig in and you're not going to take in new information that might be right in front of you that could help you find a solution. Part of the reason people don't do that is because uncertainty is uncomfortable, but it's part of the negotiation process. And we have to learn to sit with it, which forces us to learn to be adaptable, flexible, and all that kind of stuff um, as we manage this process. So these are really key notions from my point of view about people's mindset. Okay.
The other thing that I just want to make a comment on,
Yep.
I love everything that you've said, is that I think some people think of every negotiation as a conflict, again,
Mhm.
binary. And if instead you can take this approach that this is a problem that we need to jointly solve, then
Yeah.
even if you're conflict averse, you can have a productive negotiation with excellent outcomes for everybody. But if you walk in being afraid that it's you against them, it won't, it makes it much harder to come to that problem solving place.
Without question. And for me, there's three reasons why you negotiate. One is to try to reach a deal, right? That it makes sense from a business point of view to do that. The second is to build relationships, actually, because if you're going to work with the same people over and over again, having a relationship makes negotiations easier. So the purpose of a negotiation can actually be simply to try to build a relationship for future business. That, I mean, that's what entrepreneurs do in large part is they're always looking for who are potential business partners, right? And that comes through relationships. And the third, to your point, Deborah, is that we negotiate when we have to deal with conflicts and difficult conversations and things like that. And for me, I mean, I have a PhD in conflict analysis and resolution, so I kind of view all this a lot differently than most people. Um, there's nothing in my mind that's inherently problematic about conflict. It's, again, we're back to mindset. When people hear the word conflict, they run scared as opposed to saying, well, when we have a conflict, actually, what that's telling us is there's a problem to be solved between us. It's pointing you in a direction of something that's not working. And I always say to the businesses that I work with, if a client comes to you and brings up a conflict, and says, we've got a real problem. That's not a bad thing. They're trying to tell you this isn't working. We have to fix it. And if you want to keep our business, like fix it, help me fix it. Right. So otherwise, if people don't do that, then you're sitting there groping around in the dark trying to figure out what's going on here. Right. So exactly. Okay. So here's a quick challenge for you. And you can put your answers in the chat. Okay. So there's this horse and he's in the middle of a field and it's a dirt field, so there's no grass, okay? And there's 25 feet between him and a bale of hay, and there's 15 feet of rope that's tied to the horse. There's nobody else around, okay? So the question is he going to starve? How can he get to the hay and eat it? So what thoughts do you have here? You can put them in the chat or just uh, unmute and shut them out.
I mean, we can have a conversation. There aren't so many of us.
Or if you're, like I said, if you're more comfortable, pop it in the chat.
What was the question?
So the question is he going to starve? There's 25 feet between the horse and the hay. There's 15 feet of rope tied to the horse in a field by himself, grass. There's no grass in on the field. It's all mud.
And you're asking us to
I'm
give
asking you to tell me whether he's going to starve or not. And if he's not going to starve, how is he not going to starve?
Brian's asking some clarifying questions here.
Okay, so it's tied around his neck, like you see there, and the horse is about 6 feet long. So he's still a little bit short. But that's a good question.
Yeah, I was thinking,
So oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was gonna ask the same thing. If he's 10 feet long, maybe he could reach it some way, or maybe the wind will blow the straw to him.
Good. Now we're thinking creatively. Okay. What
Cindy?
else?
I was thinking of the wind also, or maybe the rope will come loose or he'll chew it off, I mean, um,
Okay, so you
I'm
can't
trying
chew it
to think.
off, but
No.
nope. So is the rope tied to the hay cart? No, it's not tied to the hay cart, but you're getting close.
Oh, so the rope's just laying on the ground?
Right. So the rope is not
Okay.
tied to anything.
Okay.
So we
Okay.
can just walk over to the hay. So
Yeah.
what was the point of this? The point of this is I just told you that when you make assumptions, they get in the way of successful negotiation, right? And most people make the assumption that the other end of the rope is tied to something, a reasonable assumption, but that's actually how you solve the problem is you realize it's not tied to anything, right? So it's very easy for us to do this without us really thinking about it and without us really realizing that this is what's going on. Okay, so just, and I would say to you this, when you're in a negotiation, one of the best things you can do throughout the process is turn on your assumptions checker. And if something comes up and somebody says something, you should immediately be thinking, I wonder if there's an assumption they're making that I'm not making because I don't understand what they're getting at or why. Right? So, okay. So let's get into the myths that I mentioned. So the first myth is that compromise is synonymous with negotiation. So why would I say this? Well, first of all, when I ask people, in a training, tell me words that come to mind when you hear the word negotiation. Invariably, somebody will say compromise. In fact, most people will say compromise. Here's the problem with compromise. It's a lazy way to negotiate. Why do I say that? Because if you and I are negotiating and we hit a bump in the road, right? Like let's say that we're negotiating about a rent and there's a big gap between what you want and what I want. We could immediately split the difference or try to split the difference, right? But we don't know what else is going on in this negotiation. And so when people rush to compromise, they eliminate the possibility that there's a creative solution out there. So 5 years ago, almost 6 years ago now, I guess, I wrote a book called The Book of Real World Negotiations. And the book is 25 cases of negotiations from around the world. And the idea was to show people that actually successful negotiation doesn't really rely on compromise. It relies on creative problem solving and thinking differently. And I did a interview, I don't know, 5 years ago with Forbes India. And the title of the article is Compromise Should Be the Last Stop on the Train. What's that? Oh, I don't know if somebody was just unmuted. So the title of the article was Compromise Should Be the Last Stop on the Train, not the first. And my point is, you can always compromise. You can always give something up in the end in order to reach a deal. But before you do that, I want you to understand what are all the things that the other side values. And much of the time, if you rush to compromise, you don't know. You haven't asked, you haven't explored what's really important to you in this negotiation. What else could we do that might be of value to you? Those are conversations that are not about compromise. And part of the reason people don't like to negotiate is because of this. They think that in order to reach agreement, they have to give up something of great value to them. Nobody wants to do that, and I don't blame them. And that's why I say, hold off. Compromise should be the last thing you do. Try to creatively understand what you need and what the other side needs. And I can tell you this, much of the time, if you get into that mode of thinking that way, you will notice that you're not talking much about compromise. You're talking much more about what matters to the other side and how can we satisfy that. And there's often a lot of ways that that can happen. It's not that compromise is an awful notion. It's just that I don't equate it with being synonymous with successful negotiation. And again, the biggest reason is if you think about a compromise solution to anything, it means that it's a suboptimal outcome, right? Like you had to give up something really important. It's like, well, maybe we shouldn't be aiming for the bottom. Maybe we should be aiming for the best deal possible. And you're not going to get it through compromise. And if you think about, just step back for a minute and think about the history of humanity, there are a lot of problems and a lot of challenges that we as human beings have encountered because we came up with compromise solutions to complicated problems. One of my favorite quotes is from Nietzsche, who was not the nicest human being, but it's a great quote. And he said, for every problem, there is a simple solution that is, or sorry, for every complex problem, there's a simple solution that is wrong. And I think that's the problem with compromise is that we're looking for a simple solution. Now, if time is of the essence, okay, if time is one of the most important interests that you have in a negotiation, then maybe you need to compromise. But um, but I would advocate and really push you to think about compromise differently and say, let me wait, let me hold off. I don't need to rush to compromise. You can always get there eventually. Okay. All right. Next one. Reaching agreement is the mark of success in negotiation. So I'm saying that this is a myth. Anybody want to tell me why I think it's a myth? You can unmute your phone or just put it in the chat. Any thoughts?
Hmm. Well, because is that similar to compromising then?
In some way, yeah. Say more, please.
Um, Mark of success in negotiation.
So when you go into negotiation, what are you trying to do? What's your goal for many people? When I ask them this question, like, what are you trying to do in a negotiation? They'll say, I'm trying to reach agreement. And I will say, no, you're not. And they're like, what do you mean? Isn't that what we're doing? And here's the reason I say that this is not that this is a myth, okay? It's not hard to reach agreement. I can give away all kinds of things in order to reach agreement. So it's a bad agreement, but it's still an agreement, right? And we used to think this in the field. And then what we started to realize is, wait a minute, if we reach these agreements that don't really meet anybody's interests or that are these compromises, right? Uh, is that really success? Like if we walk away and 3 days later the agreement collapses because it actually wasn't a good agreement at all, like is that success? And the answer is no. So success in negotiation is meeting your objective as best as possible. So you go into a negotiation and like, here's my goal. I want to, get this person's business, or I want to sell this many widgets, or whatever it is, right? That is what you should be thinking about in terms of success. And when you think that way, it changes your whole frame of reference because you're no longer thinking, I have to reach an agreement. You're thinking, I have to meet my objective. And somebody put in the chat exactly right, Sean. Sometimes walking away is a success. Success. Geez, it'd be nice if I could talk today. And you're right because when you say, okay, here's my objective, and what is being offered to me doesn't meet that at all, right? Then I should walk away. And that's why it changes what you're doing and it changes the way you think about what's going on. So if you have in your mind that, hey, what I'm doing here is I need to try to meet my objective as best as possible. And if there's another way for me to do that, if there's another client out in the wings or whatever that maybe is more amenable to the things that I'm asking, then great, right? Jim, success, both sides feel happy about an agreement. So look, in an ideal world, yes, okay. I don't typically talk a lot about win-win because I know the world doesn't always work that way. So I usually talk about mutual gain. Like, can you gain more than where you are right now? Can you meet most of your interests or get yourself as close as possible to that objective? And when you look out at the landscape of other alternatives, you realize, you know what? This is my best way to either meet my objective or get as close as possible to it as I can. So on some level, yes, in the best world, both sides feel really good about what they've done. In a reasonable world, they feel pretty good. about it. And they feel like, hey, this isn't perfect. I didn't get exactly everything I wanted, but I got the things that were really important. So in negotiation, we also have to um, sort of prioritize our interests, prioritize the things that are important, right? And we might list out in this negotiation, I'd like to get 5 things. And if you can get 3 or 4 of the top things that you want, and the fifth one, it would be nice to have, but it's not critical, that's a success. That's a good outcome of a negotiation. Okay? So again, this is about changing the way you see what you're doing in negotiation. And then the last one, I gave this one away already. Um, Listen, most people, when emotions begin to play a role in negotiation, most people get nervous because they've had people get angry. They've had people manipulate them. They've had people do different things. And so when I say keep emotions out of negotiation, if I were to ask you what emotions come to mind, put some in the chat. What are the emotions that come to mind when you hear me ask that question or say this? Okay, anger, what else? Frustration, fear. Yep. Any others? Sadness. Okay. So disappointment. Okay. So look, all of them are negative. Not one person said, oh, passion, right? You got anxiety too. There are positive emotions as well, but we don't think about those. But those are the things that drive us. When we're in a negotiation and we care very much about what's going to happen in that negotiation, then of course our emotions are going to be part of it. It's inevitable. Human beings are logical and emotional creatures. So if I told you, hey, we should keep logic out of the negotiation, you'd be like, you're a moron. Why are we even listening to you? Right? And it's the same notion when it comes to emotions. You can't keep them out. And just because they don't get expressed, by the way, doesn't mean they're not there. So there's a great book by my colleague, again, who's passed away, Roger Fisher, and his co-author, Dan Shapiro, called Beyond Reason. And it's all about how emotions are really fuel for negotiation. And that if you suppress emotions, you actually end up creating more problems and more challenges. And here's the other thing about not, quote unquote, not bringing emotions in. Most people are really bad at hiding their emotions. If you're angry, sad, feeling anxious, you don't think I can tell? Of course I can. And it's not hard to read people if you really pay attention, right? But then I'm left as the other negotiator guessing what's wrong with Deborah, as opposed to you just saying, you know what, kind of frustrated. I thought we'd be able to make more progress or something like that. Or look, we've got this deadline and we're not getting there. So you need to know I'm feeling anxious. Now I've told you, hey, here's what's going on for me in a way that's productive. Like I didn't blow up the process. I told you I'm frustrated. Oh, wow. Okay. Well, let's talk about why you're frustrated because why you're frustrated is going to help me figure out how to help you to not be frustrated, which means we can make progress in our negotiation. Okay. So again, you know, I believe very strongly that you are who you are. You know, people often say to me, well, how long do I fake it till I make it in a negotiation? I'm like, you don't. You have to be you in your negotiations. You can be transparent. Um, yeah, those masks are scary. I agree. You have to be who you are. It's like, you know, I do a lot of work with leaders, and the first thing I say to them is, if you're not prepared to be authentic and be yourself, then I'm going to leave because I'm not prepared to help you to kind of figure something out just to get by or to dupe people or whatever. And you have to be who you are in that authentic way. And you have to own your stuff. Like you're not perfect. If you think you need to be perfect as a leader, you're gonna fail. So like it's okay to say to your staff, you know, I don't know. I need some more time to think about this. Or here are the possible outcomes. I don't know which one's best. Let's talk about it. That vulnerability is really important and it goes back to the emotional part of who you are. Okay? All right. So let's talk about barriers to success. So I hate to tell you this, but negotiation is complicated. Maybe you're getting that picture. It's a lot harder than a lot of people think. And so I want to share some places where people get tripped up um, before we kind of get into talking a little bit about, other aspects of negotiation. So one place where people fail to really prepare adequately is around understanding the landscape of what they're doing, the landscape of a negotiation. So when most people look at a negotiation, they're like, okay, it's me and the client, or it's me and the vendor, or whatever, right? At that top table. So we call this diagram the three tables of negotiation. So the top table is that primary negotiation table. But most negotiations are more complicated than that. That we have constituents um, that sit behind us at a metaphorical table. So, if I go back,
Use that landlord example and help me understand who the constituents are.
yeah. So I was just going to say, if I go back to summer, right? So if you're talking to, let's just say, the father of a family who's living there, right? And you're negotiating with them, who are their constituents? Well, let's say they're married and they have kids. Certainly their spouse, like if their spouse really loves living in that place, their spouse is going to be like, hey, don't screw this up. We want to stay here. The kids are in school, right? And we don't want to move them because that's traumatic. So your kids are now a constituent. Let's say you also live near, um, they live near their family and their grandparents help take care of them. They're constituents, right? Um, so when we're thinking about this, we have to be thinking who are the people who are going to be influencing that person at the table, either directly or indirectly, right? And
So
it could be,
as the landlord, if you had a co-owner or your spouse and it was an investment that your
yeah,
family had, those would be your
yeah,
constituents, right?
right. Or maybe there are creditors, right? And others that come into the picture, etc. Exactly. And the thing is that most problems in negotiation can be traced back to the people who are not at the table. Those are the people who put up the biggest stink, who say you didn't think about this or you're not considering that, etc. A lot of times, if you have a boss, right, and you have to go back to your boss and say, "Here's why I accepted the deal." Well, you better have a good reason and you better know what's important to them as part of this. I'll give you a quick example of what I mean. One of my very first jobs, like 20 years ago, consulting, was with a small company. And the CEO called me and he said, look, I need you to come. We have six salespeople, and I need you to tell me why they keep coming back with these bad deals. Like they're getting deals, but they're either not profitable, barely profitable, or they're losing money. I said, sure. He's like, they don't know how to negotiate. You need to talk to them. So I meet with the six people and I say, so somebody help me understand what's going on here, because this is what your boss told me. And they're like, well, our metrics are that we should not come back without a deal. So that's what we do. So I went back to the boss and I said, listen, I hate to tell you this, but you're the problem because you're telling people the wrong thing and you're judging them on whether they reach a deal or not. Again, remember back to the success thing, right? I'm like, what you ought to be telling them is maximize profit for the company. And if you get to a place where a deal can work or not work and it doesn't work, then walk away. But that's not what you're telling them. He's like, oh. So the point is, right, that he was the constituent that was actually the problem
Yeah,
and they didn't.
I think the classic example of this is when
Yeah,
you're negotiating for a car and
yeah,
the guy
of
keeps
course.
saying, "Oh, I have to go back to the
Right.
sales manager or the owner of the dealership, whatever," because
Yeah,
the guy who you're negotiating with isn't really the decision maker, right? And he's not at the table with you.
correct. And that's also a game that car dealers play because it gives them the ability to do the good cop, bad cop thing. Um, and by the way, it's interesting because that is changing. So I don't know how many, some people are from Western Massachusetts, others are from other places, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
I have a friend, his name's Gary Rome. He owns a big car dealership here where I live. Nice, very nice guy. My kids went to school with his kids when they were little, and we would go to birthday parties and sit and talk about negotiation. And he would say to me, he's like, that model, that good cop, bad cop thing is a disaster. He's like, we don't do that. Like, I'm not interested. And he said, do you know why it's not in our interest to do that? And I said, no, tell me. He said, where do you think we make our money? I said, selling cars? He's like, no, we don't make that much money selling cars. He's like, we make money with service. So if I piss you off in our negotiation and you feel like you go need to go home and take a shower, like then you're not coming back to do service. So how you leave here, if you leave in a good way saying that was a good process and I feel like I got a deal that I'm happy with and I'm sure the dealer did as well, then you're going to come back for service going forward, right? So those kinds of things, like people engage in self-defeating behavior in negotiation without really realizing what's going on. But that is a good example of the constituent thing. Okay. So when you go into a negotiation or when you're planning to go into negotiation, try to think of this model. And by the way, Deborah, you're free to share the slides with folks if they would like them. Folks, just please don't like blast them out to everybody. Just keep them for yourself. I mean, if you want to share them within your companies, that's okay. Um, but yeah. Anyway, so this is one thing that you want to do is and try to think broadly and say, okay, so I know I'm negotiating with this person. What do I know about this person? Like, do I know that do they have any partners? Do they have what? And when if you start to get stuck, like I will often say, if somebody says, I just can't do that. I'll often say, look, tell me a bit more about why. Like, do you think you're going to have a problem taking this back to somebody? And a lot of times they'll be like, yeah, I don't know how to sell this to my boss. It doesn't meet our goal. I'm like, okay, well, if it doesn't meet your goal, then we need to talk about how to do this differently, right? But it gives you an opportunity to sort of be thinking who's not at the table, right? Okay, that's barrier one. Barrier two had to do with the video, one of the videos that I asked you to watch. We're not going to watch it now because it takes too much time, and we've only got like 30 minutes, 40 minutes left.
Yeah, I'll resend the link so that if you missed it the first round, you can watch it the second time.
Yeah, so this video is all about something called the ladder of inference. And the ladder of inference is a really terrific tool that will help you to kind of suss out, if I can use that phrase, what the perspective is of the other person that you're negotiating with, what assumptions they're making, and what their mindset is. Um, and so, the ladder of inference is a tool where basically it was developed by a guy named Chris Argyris. And what he basically was trying to say is when we're in a given situation, what we do is we notice certain information. Okay. So, and actually, it's interesting. There was a study at Stanford about 5 years ago, maybe longer now, um, that said that people notice about 30% of what's going on in any interaction. So in a negotiation, we're only noticing 30% of what's happening because we're focused on ourselves and what we're trying to do and things along those lines. And so he says that what happens is people create this ladder of inference in their minds when they meet with somebody. So they start out by noticing certain information, certain data, right? Then they add meaning to that information. They say, "Oh, well, if this is the data or this is the information that's in front of me, here's what that means." Right? And then they start making assumptions about that. And if that's what this means, then we should assume that they have these constraints or whatever, and as a result, we shouldn't ask for them or we need to think differently, right? So what happens with the latter is we end up creating an entire story in our minds of what's going to happen. And so if you understand this, and by the way, that ladder, that whole process happens in a very quick time period, like 30 seconds, if that. Okay. And so we're creating this entire story of what's going to happen. And that's the story that I want you to try to short circuit. That I want you to say, you know what, let me just ask questions. The best negotiators are not the smoothest talkers. They're the people who ask the best questions and listen very carefully for the information coming back at them. Why? Because we already talked about the fact that we're always working with incomplete information. So information is the currency of negotiation. If I learn that my tenant, um, you know, has kids and they're really happy in their school system, then I know that they don't want to go anywhere. And that helps me to sort of maybe negotiate a little differently, right? Things along those lines. So have a watch of the ladder because it plays an important role. And you'll see yourself in this situation. Okay. But remember that the barrier here is that, when I sit down with somebody, it's not a clean slate. I'm sitting down, like I've done some homework on them, and I have a perception of them. And let's just say, okay, that I had a bad experience before, sorry, Summer, with landlords, right? Well, I might be transferring that perception of landlords as a group of people to you, right? And so I'm going to come in and I'm going to be guarded and I'm going to make assumptions about the kind of person that you are, Summer, etc., right? And so you see the problem in the barrier, and all of those things limit my ability to negotiate because I'm now on the defensive and I've already created a story that you're trying to take advantage of me. Okay? All right. So, all right. So the next video that I asked you to watch is how do we persuade people? Okay. And the video is about Aristotle. And Aristotle wrote a book many of you may have seen or heard about called Rhetoric. So this is not new, it's over 2,300 years old, but he talks about three means of persuasion. And in the United States, we tend to focus on one of those means most of the time, and that is logos or logic. We look for data, we look for facts, blah, blah, blah. Okay. And that's how we try to persuade the other. We're going to lay out the case in front of them. But there are two other ways that we can persuade others. And frankly, the best persuasive approach is where you use all of these. But what you'll notice if you're really paying attention is that people will give you a sense of what's going to persuade them if you listen carefully, right? And there are two other parts to this equation. So, like I said, the first is logos or logic. The second is ethos. So, ethos is credibility or trustworthiness. Like, do you, for example, if you're a car dealer, do you have a reputation of being trustworthy or sleazy? And if it's sleazy, then it's going to be a hard sell as to why I should listen to you and why I should be persuaded by you, right? So ethos is like the messenger and what baggage do they bring and things along those lines. And there may be times where you're not the best messenger. Maybe there's somebody else in your company who would be a better messenger for different reasons. And so you have to ask yourself that question. The third approach to persuasion is, in my mind, the one that we use the least and we should use the most. And that is pathos. So pathos is the emotional connection that you create with the other. So like we might do that with stories. Like stories or examples are a really good way of persuading people, and yet we don't use them. So if I encounter somebody very difficult in a negotiation, they're digging in, they're being very competitive. What I've noticed is if I say to them, listen, can I just give you an example or tell you a story of how I dealt with a similar problem in one of my previous negotiations? And they'll usually say, fine, go ahead. And so me doing that begins to change how they're seeing the problem. And what's really interesting, I've done a good bit of research on storytelling and things along those lines. When you tell a story, people see themselves in some way, shape, or form in that story, even though they weren't part of it. They can imagine themselves being in that. And stories are universal. Like everybody loves stories. We grew up loving stories, right? For me, Dr. Seuss and Curious George were the characters that I most resonated with, right? And I loved the idea of being curious, etc. So when you're trying to persuade someone, and let me give you a quick example of how this can be helpful. So maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I don't know how long it was, but a while ago, I was doing a training for an engineering firm. It's a company I've worked, actually, I'm going into my 29th year this year of consulting with them. I teach a lot of classes for them and I do a lot of training. So I was doing a training in Denver and a woman came up to me and I explained this framework and she said, you know what? I think I understand why I haven't been able to persuade the person that I've been dealing with for the last 3 months. I'm like, okay, tell me more. So she says, I've been using logic and I'm dealing with a project manager from the city of Denver who's relatively new and just out of college. And I've been trying to explain to them, a problem came up it's a big wastewater treatment plant project. Okay. And a problem came up and I've been saying, Like this is the way to fix it. And I've been using data and other kinds of information, logic, as most engineers will do, right? And she keeps saying no. And when I say why, she says, I just don't know if that's true or not. I need some guarantee this will be successful. I said, okay. And she said, I'm almost positive that what's going on is she's very afraid of making a mistake because she's new. And I never really thought about it that way. But now I'm thinking I need to take a pathos approach and focus on the emotional thing. Because if someone is worried, right, if something is keeping them up at night, all of the logic in the world isn't going to make that better. You have to address the fear, right? Like that's how humans work, right? So I said, okay. She's like, I'm going to go back and ask her the question, tell me what's keeping you up at night and see what happens. I said, great. So a week later, I get an email, and the header of the email says success with an exclamation point in all caps. She's like, I went in, I asked her, and the floodgates opened. She was like, I'm worried about this, 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 and I don't know how what you're proposing is going to do that, which gave her the opportunity to then share logic and data, but only after she understood that she was fearful of these different things. So when we are trying to persuade people, like listen carefully for what's really going on and then think about which of these you really want to focus in on. And when you're not sure, I'm a big fan of, having some stories at your disposal, things you've experienced that anybody can understand that you can then utilize. Okay? All right. Nope, we're not going to do that. Okay. So fourth barrier is that there are different negotiation styles. You may not know this or you may know this, but the nice thing is that there are 5 approaches to negotiation. There's not some infinite number. And people often say to me, well, one of the biggest problems I have is I don't know what to expect from the other side, right? Like I don't know what they're going to do. And so when I share with them that there are these different negotiation styles, you begin to learn to notice what are you dealing with, right? So the 5 styles are competing. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you see low to high concern for self, so how much I care about my own interests, my own needs, right? And on the top, low to high concern for the other, which means how much I care about the relationship, okay? So competitors care about what they need and they don't place a high concern on the relationship, okay? If you can get what you need, fine, but that's not really what's motivating or driving me. Then we have avoiders, okay? So from this model, this suggests avoiders don't care about what they need and they don't care about the relationship. That's really not the case. Avoiders are deathly afraid of negotiation. They've had bad experiences or whatever, and it hasn't gone well, and so they just want to avoid at all costs. Then you have the compromisers who have that attitude that I mentioned before. Let's split the difference. Half the pie is better than nothing. Let's keep the process moving. Accommodators place a high value on the relationship and a low value on what's most important to them. So they would prefer to reach an agreement that preserves the relationship, even if they have to let go of what matters to themselves. And then you have collaborators. Collaborators place a high value on the relationship and a high value on what's important to them. And in many ways, in an ideal world, that's where we would all kind of gravitate to, but not everybody's there. The nice thing about this is these are not written in stone. This is not Myers-Briggs. You're an ENTJ, whether you like it or not. This is a choice. This is how you've learned to negotiate to this point in your life, and you can learn how to do other things. So, for example, if I want to be collaborative, right? I want to meet my interests and I also want to try to preserve the relationship, but I'm an accommodator. Well, what do I need to learn? I need to learn to be assertive. And that's not easy for a lot of people, but that's what you need to learn to do. So then you need to focus in on how do I learn to be, more assertive in my negotiations. And the old adage, if you don't ask, you're not going to get is very true. Like people aren't mind readers. So if you struggle with assertiveness, that's a realm where you have to say, okay, let me try to work on that. Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk briefly. I know it's 5 o'clock. Or at least 5 o'clock on the East Coast. So I'm going to talk briefly about this and probably may skip through this just a little bit. So I can get to the models and
This is going great. So just go where you got to go.
okay. So as I mentioned, managing the emotional piece of this is going to play a role. And the question is, what do we do with that, right? So the broader answer is learn emotional intelligence. If you don't have emotional intelligence, um, not only are you not going to be good at negotiation or dealing with conflict or whatever, you're not going to be good at your job. So it's very worthwhile to invest in emotional intelligence. Okay. And there's a lot of stuff out there to do that. So I would encourage you to really work on that part if you feel like, yeah, when emotions come up, I struggle. And so, so, but in the interim, there's a tool that I introduce and I often share with folks, and they find it to be pretty helpful. And it's called going to the balcony. And it's not about jumping off the balcony like this picture seems to suggest. It's about taking a different view. It's about stepping back when things get difficult, right? Um, and pausing, giving yourself the time to take a break and to think about, where do I need to go here? How am I going to manage? Like, how do I understand what's going on with my own emotions? Like, when you are emotionally intelligent, you're self-aware, you know your own emotions, and you know how to recognize the emotions in the other. Okay. That's part of what emotional intelligence is all about. Okay. And then you understand the interrelationships between the two. So the balcony is sort of this metaphorical place that you step back to. So let's imagine you're in a negotiation and it's getting maybe pretty tense and frustrations are riding high. That's where most people make their biggest mistake, is when emotions are at their height. Because what happens is people get into fight or flight mode, right? And so I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But if you just pause and step away, get a coffee, take a break, what happens is that's one way to manage your emotions. I'm not saying that you walk away and don't come back. You come back. That's the important part of this, okay? But taking a break is really important because it helps you to take a breath and say, okay, like the sky's not falling. We can get there if we can figure out what's going on and why frustration or why I'm feeling the way I am or whatever it might be. Okay. So, and people often say to me, "Oh, well, can you really just walk away?" I'm like, "Sure." And the nice thing about negotiation is there's no rules. There are laws and other kinds of things, but there's no rules. So, yeah, why can't you? And I'll tell you this, I'm fortunate in many of my own negotiations. I'm not under time pressure much of the time. Sometimes I am, but most of the time I'm not. So usually when I get to a place where I think we might have the parameters of a good agreement that really works for me, I will pause and say, this is great. I think we've made some awesome progress, whatever. Can I sleep on it and get back to you in the morning? And what I am doing is self-imposing a balcony break. I am, because usually in the middle of the night, I'll wake up and go, wait a minute. If I agree to that, then that means this. And I don't want to do that. So now I have to go back to the drawing board, right? Time to reflect and time to think things through is really important. This is why I also am kind of an advocate of, at times, knowing what's the right medium to use. You know, people always say, oh, negotiating face to face is the best. And I don't know about that, because there are a lot of people who feel very anxious about sitting across from somebody and they can't think clearly and they can't advocate for themselves, but they're better doing that via email, right? Because email, you don't have to respond in the moment. You can actually take time to think. You just have to know how to negotiate through email and the pitfalls and the downsides of doing that, right? But there's also that big upside of not feeling like I have to respond right now and say something, because that is where people make that mistake, okay? So briefly, we've talked about the notion that negotiation requires logic and emotion. What we're doing with this is to temporarily suspend your emotions, to look at them and understand them, and to think about why something is challenging. When you go to the balcony, that's what you're doing. You're stepping back and saying, what's going on here? Why am I frustrated? Why am I angry? Why is this difficult? Right? You're having that conversation in your mind. And so when you're doing that as well, you want to be thinking, okay, well, what's going on here? Why is this, as I said, why is this difficult? Is it, that, well, I had a bad experience with a previous landlord and Summer's a landlord. Therefore, she just said something that my old landlord used to say, and it used to drive me crazy. And it was his way of manipulating things. And so, right. So again, we're back to this whole story we tell ourselves. And what we need to do is we need to go into our negotiations and to know what are our triggers. We all have triggers. People say things that annoy us, frustrate us, etc. And we need to know what those are because our triggers are the things that set us off, and our emotions are the endpoints. The emotions are what happens, right? So we need to know if somebody says or does this, you know, why does that bother me? Why does that challenge me? So we're not going to do this now because we don't have that much time. But what I would encourage you to do is think about what are the things that somebody could say to you that would really drive you nuts, right? And be aware of that. So that if you think, okay, when someone is really condescending to me, that causes me to fall off the balcony, then keep that in mind. And if someone's condescending, you might need to say, okay, you know what? I'm going to just grab a coffee and think about this, right? And then when you've settled yourself down, you come back and say, look, um, I got to tell you, like, when you said that, it came across as really condescending. I don't know if that's what you meant, but that's what happened for me. And that's why I needed to take a break. And they'll either say, well, that's too bad for you, or, oh, wow, I didn't mean that. I didn't mean to say it that way, whatever. Okay. Yeah. And calm down, right? Calm down's the classic. I mean, hopefully most people know not to say that, because all it does is add another log to the fire, if you will. But the other thing I want you to notice is physically what happens to you when you get triggered. We all have a reaction. It's not, I get angry. That's not what I mean. What I mean is your face gets flush. You can feel your heart beating through your chest. You start sweating, your hands get clammy. That's what I mean. And the reason that's happening is because you're getting in fight or flight mode. And who knows what happens to the blood in our body when we get into fight or flight mode? Here, spoiler alert, I'll tell you. All of the blood rushes to your core and then to your hands and your feet. We can hopefully see what the problem is with that, which is there's no blood running to our brains. Blood carries oxygen, helps us to think clearly. So we're not thinking clearly. And as a result, we want to relieve that pressure. So we either walk away or we say yes when we really should be saying no to alleviate the pressure. I'm sure there isn't a person on this call who hasn't said yes to something they didn't want to do, walked out of the room, kicked themselves, and said, I can't believe I just did that. That is because you did not manage the emotional thing and you didn't go to the balcony. So the balcony is your friend. And when that physical thing happens to you, that's the sign. Shut up. Stop talking. Don't agree to anything. Step away and think about where you are. Okay? That's how you use this as a tool until we're going to skip this because. Okay. So I'm going to introduce this and then I think I'm going to stop because I'd really like to have more of a conversation than me just talking this entire time. So there are two models of negotiation. Okay. There's the positional approach and then there's the interest-based approach. The positional approach is one that's been around for a very long time. And basically, it's really much more about bartering and bargaining than it is about negotiating. It's a very sort of typical high-low approach, um, very focused on price and things like that. When might you want to use a positional approach to negotiation? In my mind, you use them in one-time negotiation. So if I'm in a bazaar in the Middle East and I want to buy a rug, I'm going to use a positional approach. I'm going to make a very high offer or very low offer, I should say, and I'm just trying to get the best price. I don't care about the relationship. I don't care about anything else, right? That's what I'm doing. Now, if I were to ask you all, how many of your negotiations are one-off kind of scenarios like that compared to negotiating with the same people or the same companies over and over again? If you're the typical business like I work with, most people would say about 10 or 15% are one-off negotiations and uh, 85 to 90% are with the same people over and over again or the same companies, right? So but a positional negotiation or a positional negotiation approach doesn't make much sense for people in business because the biggest danger with a positional approach is it damages your reputation because it's usually about manipulation, it's about deception. If we go back to our car dealer example, they were using a positional approach. They were trying to manipulate you, get you, they'll talk about all the bells and whistles and you don't want those things, but you agree anyways because you feel pressured, right? And that's why you don't go back. to those places because that didn't feel good. The interest-based approach is, again, you're trying to meet your short-term interest, but you're also building the long-term relationship so that as you go through your negotiations um, with that person, they should get easier because you should have built trust and a relationship with them. And that means that you're willing to share information. In a positional negotiation, people hold their cards back. Okay, they don't share information because they're worried that you're going to take it and manipulate it. In an interest-based negotiation, you share it in a reciprocal manner. Meaning, if I'm negotiating with Deborah, I say, "Look, I'm going to tell you something that's important to me, and my doing that is uh, I'm hopeful that you're going to reciprocate and that you're going to share something that matters to you." And we get into a process where we're sharing information so that we can use that information to build not just some average deal, but actually the best deal possible based on what you care about. Right? And the interest-based approach to negotiation, it's often when I introduce this, people say, "Oh, that sounds like a nice way to negotiate." I'm like, it's not a nice way to negotiate. For most people, it's actually far more comfortable because you're not being manipulative. But it's based on the merits. It's based on if somebody makes a really good case or a really good argument, you'll listen to it, right? Doesn't mean you're going to agree, but like you'll take it in. And it's also based on the difference between positions and interest. Okay. Positions are what people say they want. Interests are why they want those things. So if we go back to summer and our lack of a binary negotiation and we talk about the different things that people value, that is what you do in an interest-based negotiation. You're looking for what people value, for what they care about and why, right? That's the search. And if you can get down to that, you're going to come up with much better deals that actually don't often require um, compromise. And I'm going to give you a quick example, and then I'm going to stop. So, in Getting to Yes, that book by Fisher and Urey was written in 1981, by the way, and it's still on the bestseller list. So there must be something in there that's worthwhile, and they're very happy campers. Um, they begin the book with a story of two sisters, okay? And they're in the kitchen, and they each want the orange. There's one orange on the counter, and they each think it's theirs. So what do? They start arguing, it doesn't go anywhere, and finally they say, okay, let's just cut it in half, and you take your half, and I'll take my half, and let's call it a day. And the other sister says, fine. So they cut it in half. One sister walks over to the garbage, peels takes the peel off the fruit, right? Throws away the peel and starts eating the fruit. The other sister, and then that sister walks away. The other sister goes over to the trash and peels the fruit again and throws away the fruit and takes the peel and starts cutting it up so she could make an orange cake. Now, if they had talked about why they wanted the orange, each of them would have gotten twice that they ended up getting, right? But because they didn't talk about it and they just ran to compromise, they didn't get to the underlying interest. And the underlying interest is why. Why do you want that? Why is that so important? Why does that matter to you? You get the idea, okay? And you don't want to do it as a 5-year-old kid. Why? Why are we doing this? Why are we going, right? But you do want to do it as an inquiry and say, well, tell me about that. Like, why is that so important to you? Because I didn't realize that mattered to you in this situation or whatever it is, okay? That's the heart of the interest-based approach and why it's different. There's one other concept that goes along with really any negotiation, but we use it mostly in the interest-based realm. And that's a concept called BATNA. And your BATNA is an acronym. It stands for your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And what it means is if we don't reach agreement here, what am I going to do? And you always need to know what your BATNA is. And just because we use the word best alternative to a negotiated agreement doesn't necessarily mean it's a good alternative. You might not have a good alternative. And if you don't have a good alternative, then you need to stay at the table and be creative. But if you do have a good alternative, then that gives you a lot more sort of room to maneuver in a negotiation because I know I can walk away to something else. The classic example is I'm seeking employment, right? And if I have one job opportunity and I go to that interview and it's a negotiation, right? I'm either walking away to the unemployment line or graduate school or who knows what, right? But if I have two interviews lined up, well, the first one I go and they offer me the job for $70,000, right? And so going into the second one, I know I can walk away. So if they offer me 65,000, well, I can negotiate and say, well, I have this other offer for 70. Can you do 75? Right? So your BATNA gives you a way of assessing. If you don't think about your BATNA, you're negotiating with one hand behind your back because you never really know, well, what should I agree to? It's a form of comparison. It's a way to say, does this make sense based on my options in front of me, whether I should take this or not? Well, it depends on what your BATNA is. And sometimes if you have a bad BATNA, you can think about how do I improve it, right? And you can take measures away from the table. So for example, let's go back to the real estate scenario, right? If I'm a landlord and I'm beginning to see that the market is turning kind of in my favor, well, I can perhaps, agree to a shorter term lease or something like that initially, or take some other step until I can wait till the market has changed, and then I can think about charging a higher rent because it would be supported in that way. It's just, I'm making something up, obviously. It may not be the best example, but the point is that sometimes when we don't have a good BATNA, we can spend time thinking about how can we improve our BATNAs as part of this process. But you always want to make sure that you understand what your BATNA is because it sort of completes the picture of negotiation. Okay, so I'm stopping. I told you I would stop. All right, so let me just see what kind of questions, comments folks have about anything we talked about.
All right, I'm going to stop recording. So